Let's get right down to business then. I'm really thrilled today to have with us Senator James Tallarico of Texas. Many of you know him from the rounds he's been making on media talking about politics and how politics should look. Is a seminarian himself, but I don't think we pay enough attention to the fact he is also a former public school teacher. And my guess is that that has had something to do with his political journey. So, welcome, Senator, and please tell us why you decided to go into politics.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm a huge fan of your work and this platform, and it's an honor to be here. Well, before I was a politician, I was a public school teacher, as you mentioned. I taught sixth grade language arts on the west side of San Antonio, which is a beautiful, historic Mexican American neighborhood. It's also one of the poorest zip codes in the entire state of Texas. So every day, my students struggled heroically to overcome poverty, overcome racism, overcome systems that were designed to hold them back. And I was in the classroom right after the legislature here in Texas cut more than $5 billion from our public schools. This was in the wake of the Great Recession. And so I saw the impact of those cuts firsthand on my students and my fellow teachers and the members of the community on the West Side. And at one point, I had 45 kids in one classroom. There weren't enough desks for all those kids, so I had students sitting on the air conditioning unit in the wealthiest country in human history in the 21st century, children sitting on the air conditioning unit. And it got me mad, and I decided to do something about it. And that's what led me to the legislature and what's now leading me to run for the United States Senate.
So, I want to talk to you about Jimmy Carter and the way he talked about religion and politics together. But what's really jumping out about the way you're talking is not Jimmy Carter so much as LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, whose road to changing American society came exactly as yours has done through a public school position in which he recognized that his students were terribly underserved. Is that a model for you at all, or is that just coincidence?
Well, another coincidence is that this Senate seat that I'm running for is LBJ's Senate seat. And as a big fan of Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, I consider it a real honor to be running for his Senate seat. And I think we need that kind of bold ambition in public policy once again. I feel like on both sides of the aisle, but including in my own party, the Democratic Party, we've set our sights too low. We're no longer talking about eliminating poverty, no longer talking about building the great society and truly having a country as big as our dreams. And so I hope we can all take some inspiration from LBJ and the ambition he had to improve the lives of working people.
Well, amen to that. But one of the things that you have done when you talk about American politics is to introduce a different way to think about the role of religion in our political system in this moment. And I'd love to hear you talk more about that and how you see that, because of course you are in a red state. You are pushing back against the use of evangelical Christianity in the radical right to impose policies like the ones you just talked about. How do you see the relationship between religion and politics?
Well, my faith is the reason I'm in public service. My granddad was a Baptist preacher in South Texas. I've been going to the same Presbyterian church since I was 2 years old. I'm now a student in seminary studying to become a minister myself one day, as you mentioned. And so my faith is everything to me. And, Jesus gave us these two commandments. It's what my granddad taught me when I was little. It's what my church raised me to always follow these two commandments to love God and love neighbor. And that second one is interesting because Jesus didn't tell us to love our immediate family members or our close friends or the members of our tribe. He asked us to love our neighbors, and he defined that very broadly. And that's a public thing. And so that's what led me to public service, first as a public school teacher and now as a public official. And so I'm very open about talking about how my faith influences my politics, my service, and the policies that I fight for at the state capitol, and hopefully the policies I'll fight for in the United States Senate.
Um, You may or may not have seen today the Pope has handed down his first major statement, and it talks exactly as you're talking about. It talks about love and loving your neighbor. What does that mean for a political party, though? Because of course, our country is supposed to be founded on the separation of church and state, and you have spoken out about that in
I have.
Texas.
I
Go
have.
ahead.
I was raised to believe that the separation of church and state is a sacred boundary. And it's one that Christians throughout Texas history and American history have fought for, because that separation doesn't just benefit the state, it benefits the church. The protections go both ways. When religion gets too cozy with political power, it loses its prophetic voice and its ability to speak truth to that power. And so that separation is something that we have to honor. I have, though, clarified that a separation of church and state is not the same thing as a separation of faith and politics. You know, we all bring our moralities and our philosophies to our politics, and faith is really no different. My faith shapes my politics, and I hope it shapes the politics of every person of faith, regardless of what tradition you belong to. Just like it did for Jimmy Carter, just like it did for Dr. King and Cesar Chavez and Dorothy Day and Mr. Rogers. We are called to bring our values to the public square, but that cannot be used to force our beliefs or our doctrines on people by government force. That's where we have to draw the line. And that institutional separation of church and state is so important to honor.
Can you go back a step and talk again about what you said at the very beginning when you were talking about faith? And that was that the religion is hurt by the insertion of politics too, because you lose your ability to talk authoritatively to power. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, you know, religion at its best, Christianity at its best, challenges the powers that be. We've also seen Christianity used to benefit the people in power throughout history. But it's important to remember that our calling as Christians is the demolition of domination. It's why Christians spoke out against abolition, or I'm sorry, against slavery. Some of the first abolitionists were Christian activists. It's why people of faith spoke out against Jim Crow, against the empire, against the feudal system. That really is what we're called to do today. And we're not able to do that if our church or people of faith are in bed with the people in power, which happens way too often and has happened throughout history. So it's important to respect that boundary. Again, I don't mean to say that faith should be apolitical. I'm not even sure if there is such a thing as being apolitical. Our faith should move from the sanctuary to the streets. It should help us change the world around us. But that's not the same thing as that institutional blurring of church and state. That separation in our First Amendment is something we have to fight for every day.
It sounds as if what you're saying is that faith brought to the public sphere should always question power and should always reinforce the individual value of every human being.
That's right.
Whereas often when faith gets inserted or when religion gets inserted into politics, it works to shore up power and works to discriminate against people rather than treating them all equally. Am I putting too many words in your mouth?
No, that's exactly right. I've always said there's a difference between Christian activism and Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is dominating our neighbors instead of loving them as ourselves. It is the elevation of our faith tradition over all the rest, which again is a very unchristian-like thing to do. If you go back and read the New Testament, so many of Jesus's parables are about the outsider, the outcast, the person who's different. And in fact, the hero of many of Jesus's stories is someone outside of his own faith. The Good Samaritan, maybe the most famous parable of Jesus's, is not just about helping people on the side of the road, which is how we think about it today. A Samaritan was not just someone from a different religious group, it was actually the sworn enemy of Jesus's people, the Jewish people. And the Samaritan is the hero of that story. So, what Jesus is saying is that our neighbor love has to transcend religious boundaries. And so to have my fellow Christians in the state legislature pass bills like the kind that force every teacher to post the Ten Commandments in their classroom, the kind of bills that try to replace school counselors with untrained chaplains, the kind of bills that indoctrinate students at an early age with Christian Bible stories. Those are just antithetical, not just to our First Amendment, but to our Christian values. And so it's why I try to speak out against these Christian nationalist bills from a faith perspective, not just a constitutional perspective.
So it's interesting to me that you come from Texas, because Texas, of course, has a long history, and that your family is from there, because Texas has a long history of the kind of populism you're talking about, which is informed by faith, but what is really focusing on is the good of society and the good of everybody in it. And I'm wondering how your vision of what politics should be like, and perhaps what the Democratic Party should be like, comes together. What does that look like? Is it some sort of a return to an older form of populism that is inspired by faith and principle and yet focuses on doing good for the society as a whole? Or are you moving in a different direction?
Well, that's certainly what it is for me. This is the Democratic Party is a big tent party with lots of different kinds of Democrats, and that's a good thing. But for me, it's very much influenced by my faith, and in our tradition, there is a healthy skepticism of concentrated wealth and concentrated power. And I was raised in that tradition, and it certainly informs my politics. I've said before that I don't really see politics as left versus right. I see it as top versus bottom. I see the way that the billionaire mega donors who have increasingly taken over our politics, how they intentionally divide us with their social media algorithms, with their cable news networks. They divide us by party, by race, by gender, by religion. So we don't notice that they're picking our pockets. We don't notice that they're closing our schools, defunding our healthcare, or raising taxes on all of us while they cut taxes for themselves. And to me, that is not only part of the legacy of the Democratic Party, but it is also a legacy of the Christian religion.
So, where do you see the country going right now? I know you have spoken before about the spiritual crisis our country is in, and talked about ways that we, regardless of party, can address that crisis. How do you see American society as a whole right now?
Well, I think we've seen over the last few months, but certainly over the last few years, how the politics of division have really taken over our civic conversation. And we no longer are able to talk to each other past those disagreements. We increasingly see each other as enemies rather than as neighbors and fellow Americans. And there's no way a democracy can survive without that spiritual commitment to one another. Um, Democracy is very much a spiritual exercise. It's not just a form of government. It really is a commitment that we have to our neighbors, especially our neighbors who are different from us, especially our neighbors who disagree with us on important issues. And unless we have that moral commitment to each other, there's no way we can continue this American experiment. And so I'm, as an elected official, as a candidate, but also as a seminarian, I'm trying to speak to that spiritual dimension of our democracy so that we can continue this experiment in self-governance.
What would you tell people that they should do in this moment and going forward to protect democracy and to protect American civic life?
Well, I will go back to the commandment that I started with, which is the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. And again, that isn't limited to the neighbors who look like you. It's not limited to the neighbors who pray like you. It's not limited to the neighbors who vote like you. It is inclusive of all of your neighbors, whether they live right next to you or whether they live on the other side of the country or the other side of the world. And and so we have to think: are we truly loving our neighbors? Are we loving our neighbors who have different ideas than we do? Are we loving our neighbors who have ideas that we consider reprehensible? Because that is the challenging love that I think we're all called to. not as religious people or as Christians, but as Americans in this American democracy. And that is not easy to do. I struggle with it every single day as an elected official, as a member of the legislature. I'm sure other folks listening to this conversation struggle with it too. But it is a challenge to all of us. And I honestly think it is the only way forward if we're going to save this project called democracy.
And I would argue that democracy includes work, that it's hard work, but it is joyful work, and it is work that contributes to the national muscle so that we are able to continue it. But what does that look like for people to love each other? Like if people are listening to this and they're thinking, I'm really concerned about the way the world is right now, I'm scared, I don't like turning on the news, they want to do something. What should they be doing?
Well, love is a verb. It's an action, and so that kind of love can look very differently. All of us have a gift to give. I really do believe that, and that gift is going to be different for each of us. It may be as a candidate for office. It may be as a historian. It may be as someone who goes out and volunteers, or someone who registers voters, or someone who tries to show small acts of kindness to people that you come across in your daily life. Those gifts can be big or they can be small, but no gift of love is ever wasted. And I do believe that these ripple effects from those acts of love, there's something sometimes we don't ever see come to fruition, but those ripples spread out from each of those small acts, and I do believe it changes the world ultimately. And that's what we're all called to do every day of our lives. And it's not easy. It's a straight and narrow path that's sometimes hard to walk, but it is one that I think all as Americans and as people in the world, we're all called to walk that path together.
I love that you are running for LBJ's seat, and I love the way that you are bringing together the populism that defined Texas in the late 1890s as a different kind of politics and a different kind of masculinity, by the way. The populists in Texas were very careful to say there are many ways to be an American, and bullying and yelling and screaming is not the one that we want to have here in Texas. And of course, that's what gave birth to LBJ, and that's what gave birth to the Great Society. So thank you for doing what you're doing and being a different kind of voice in this moment.
Well, thank you for what you do. I'm so inspired by your work, and I know there's a lot of love that goes into the work that you do, and I think we can all feel that. So thank you, and really honored to be here.
Well, a lot of love and a lot of work, and I think that's what we're all doing is rolling up our sleeves. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you'll come back sometime and we can dig deeper into some of these issues.
I would love that.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
I just will give my usual disclaimer here. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. Okay, so let me go ahead here and get to some of your questions. And I will say one of the things that's interesting to me about the questions that people are asking is that they are much less pointed than at least the ones I saw today. As some of you are seeing, you saw what I just did. I've kind of been running around a lot today, so I haven't put as much time into reading your questions as I normally would do. So maybe there were more pointed questions, but I love the fact that we're backing away from the really specific questions that people have asked and starting to get more into the larger contours. What does this mean? Why are we doing this? Why is this on the table? And that's where we are today, is with larger questions and what certain things mean for American democracy right now. And these are obviously the questions that interest me, as you can tell if you read me, that I'm loving the bigger questions. And I desperately want to write something tonight that I'm going to talk a little bit about here. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to because, as I say, I'm booked solid into quite late tonight, and it's hard for me to take on a brand new topic if I don't start till 9 or 10 at night. So anyway, let me start with what you have asked. And I'm going to start here once again with the filibuster. And I might end with the filibuster as well, because many people are still asking what the filibuster is and why it's such a big deal right now. And the answer to that, as I keep saying to you every time I talk about the filibuster, is that essentially
The filibuster is a holdover from an older time. And what it amounts to is this: that when the framers put together the Constitution, they did not expect there to be all the states that we've got now. And both the House of Representatives and the Senate were small, especially the Senate, which only had 2 people per state. So if you start with 13, that's 26 people, right? So basically they expected that, people would argue about laws or whatever, and then they'd finish arguing and they'd have a vote. Well, what happened was in the House of Representatives, the House grew really quickly, much quicker than anybody expected. The House grew really quickly. And so what that meant is the House of Representatives quickly had, relatively quickly, right? This is the early 19th century. It's not immediate. But in the early 19th century, the House has to come up with procedures that give structure to the arguments that are being made so that there comes an end point. Because if you've got, now we have 435, but if you've got 120 or however many people in the House of Representatives, you could argue all the time and nothing would ever get done. So the House of Representatives comes up with a way to stop debate and get on with the vote. The Senate's much smaller, so it never does that. So if you think about it sort of historically, the filibuster is simply refusing to stop talking. That's what it is. You can make sure the Senate never takes a vote by refusing to stop talking. Now, it was very, very, very rarely used. And when it begins to be used, it's used primarily over laws that are designed to enforce civil rights. So quite famously in our history, Strom Thurmond, for example, filibustered civil rights. And what the filibuster meant was that you could have a very popular piece of legislation, and by having a minority that really hated that piece of legislation, it could stop it by talking, by just saying, I'm never going to let you guys vote. I'm just going to hold on to the floor and talk 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 until you give up. And I'm going to kill it by talking it to death. But here's the problem. I mean, there's many problems with that, but that's basically how it was used. But what happened was that this became a problem as the Senate got more and more business because it slowed everything down. It gummed up the works, and there's a lot of other things that go into slowing down Senate business as well. But what that meant was the Senate had to figure out a way to move on. So first, it comes in the early 20th century. It comes up with a system for stopping the filibuster. It's called cloture, and it's a complicated process. And if you get it passed, you don't stop the discussion, but you limit it to 30 more hours. But then they come up with the recognition that their stuff is still not moving along to the degree that they would like it to. So they change the filibuster rules in a number of ways. So one of the ways they change it is they come up with a system by which you don't have to talk. You can just say you're going to talk. So, as somebody says now, you can basically stop a bill from passing on your cell phone by saying, I'm going to block this. That's not what it's called. It's not called blocking, but you can, so instead of actually having to talk, you can just sort of say you're gonna talk, and that's enough to kill something, which is precisely how the Senate has been, the Senate Republicans have been operating, right? They won't take any. Well, that's a little bit different too, because McConnell won't take stuff up. But that's certainly what the way that the filibuster has been used for popular things. So, for example, when after Sandy Hook, when there was a huge push to get some basic, it's very popular to get some basic restrictions on gun ownership. That was actually popular, and there were 55 votes for it in the Senate. But in order to pass it, you had to have 60 votes because of the filibuster, and that's why we didn't get some background checks, for example, and some control over the sale of handguns after Sandy Hook, is because of the filibuster. So there's that, but then that's a problem, because what you could do then is that people could stop the passage of really important bills, that, funding bills, all that sort of thing. So they came up with a system by which there are certain bills that can't be filibustered, and those are going to be the bills that can be passed by what they call budget reconciliation. They're budget bills, essentially. But then there are very strict rules as to what can go into one of those, which is why the Senate parliamentarian the other day said, the minimum wage doesn't belong in here. And people got very angry at the parliamentarian. And the answer to that is, it's like getting angry at your tax accountant. The person who does your taxes might be wrong, might be right, but they're offering you advice as to what it is legal to do. And you can get a different accountant for sure, but it's not their fault that this is the way they interpret the law. There's theoretically people who know what they're doing. Again, you can disagree, you can fire them, whatever, but the parliamentarian is simply saying, yeah, you can do this, no, you can't, and can be replaced. It's an unelected job. But so anyway, so that's where we stand. That there are some bills that go through because they can't be filibustered. But then we have this huge problem because now people are recognizing that what the filibuster does. I mean, the filibuster was kind of hanging out there for a long time, but the use of the filibuster has gone off the charts because what it permits is right now it is permitting a minority. The Republicans are very much in a minority in the popular will. As you know, the 50 Republicans in the Senate represent about 41.5 million fewer people than the 50 Democrats do. But those Republicans can stop very popular legislation by filibustering or by threatening to filibuster. So what happened was that they were doing that under Harry Reid, the majority leader of the Senate under Obama, for judicial appointments. And that's when Reid went ahead and what's called nuked the filibuster. There is a quite complicated procedure by which you can create a precedent, and it's ridiculously formulaic. So it says create a precedent, but basically it's a way you call on people to go ahead and establish a new rule. And he did that with judicial appointments, but not with Supreme Court appointments, only judicial appointments, so that they could actually, Barack Obama could actually have some judicial appointments. But he didn't do it for the Supreme Court. Mitch McConnell did it for the Supreme Court. And his excuse was, well, Harry Reid started this, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. So where are we right now? We are right now with the fact that with the Senate balance 50-50, all the Republicans have to say is no, and nothing goes through. So, for example, had the Democrats not passed the American Rescue Plan through budget reconciliation, it would not have gone through. And that had extraordinarily high popularity ratings. 77% of Americans like that plan. 77%. That's I mean, 77% of Americans can't agree on anything. So that was like huge. And yet, had the Democrats not used budget reconciliation, it would have stopped dead. Now, there's a couple of things about the filibuster that are important sort of in the big picture. This really serves the Republican Party right now. And the Republican Party, as you know, is, to my mind, not itself. It's been taken over by a cabal who are trying to destroy the government, the New Deal government. And so they love the filibuster because the whole point is they don't want the government to do anything, especially the Democrats. So what they do is they stop the Democrats from doing anything through the filibuster. And then when people get angry because the government doesn't do anything, they say, see, the government's no good anyway. And so they have been, using that filibuster has been enormously effective politically for them. But what it has also done is it has put, and think about this, it has put the burden of our governance, of the lawmakers, not on the people who want to stop things, but on the people who want to do things. So this absolutely tells against people who want to use the government to help ordinary Americans. That is right now the Democrats. It's not always been this way. It happens to be the way it is now. So we've kind of got governance backward because of the filibuster. That is to say that instead of it being, put a lot of, if you want to stop a really popular law like Sandy Hook, I'll do Sandy Hook, like background checks for guns. This should be really hard to do. If everybody wants it, you should have to work really hard to do it. But instead, we've got the shoe on the other foot, that if you want to do something really, really popular, you not only have to get the majority of the American people behind you, you have to get a supermajority of the Senate. So the burden for passing legislation has gone on to the people for whom it's very difficult to do, who want to do it. But doing things has become far more difficult than not doing things. Now, what the Republicans have said is that this is a good thing. This is what the framers intended. And I want to start right out of the box by saying, if I used profanity in public, I would use it right now, because that's bull stuff. That's ridiculous. I've read the congressional record through the entire run of it. And the idea was simply that the Senate would pass things by a majority vote. End of discussion. End of discussion. 19th century, majority vote, we're done. What they're saying, what they're trying to say now, though, is that the filibuster makes things bipartisan because you have to get 60 of the opposing party in order to get anything passed. But it's a lovely thought, but that's not at all what it has turned into, because of the fact that the burden is to pass things, not to not pass things. So what it's turned into is that a very, very small group of people gets to dictate everything. And that essentially kills bipartisanship because you can't get anything through. I mean, basically, they get to dictate everything. So you see here with the American Rescue Plan, all of a sudden, a lot of Republicans who voted against the American Rescue Plan are now sort of out there going, this is a great bill, look, and they're trying to imply that they passed it when they didn't. And that the whole idea of needing to work across the aisle actually seems to have worked a lot better when you had to have just a majority to pass it, because you didn't have this recalcitrant group that would not pass anything. So I'm also, I never thought the day would come when the filibuster would become such a huge deal, but so it is. Now, so there's a couple of things going forward here with the filibuster. People are like, we either have the filibuster or we don't. No, there's also stuff in between that we could do. So, for example, we don't have a filibuster now for judicial appointments. That's how we got Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, and I'll talk about him in a minute. You can go ahead and establish precedent for limited series of bills. Financial bills, for example, now judicial appointments. There has been a suggestion that what Congress should do is it should use the nuclear option, that is, set the new precedent for any bill that has something to do with voting rights, for example. So it is possible to have something in between, that you have the filibuster for certain categories and not for others. So it doesn't have, you don't have to throw out everything. Although I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have to. I'm suggesting there is some gray area in between. But one of the things that jumps out at me about the moment, and the reason people are asking about it today, is that Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, a Republican from Kentucky, came out in the Senate, came out today and said, you've never seen scorched earth until you nuke the filibuster. We have to have the filibuster. I'm going to, be horrible if you do this. And the answer to that is, now hang on just a second. It is actually Mitch McConnell who's turned the filibuster into this extraordinary weapon. And second of all, for various reasons that I've talked about in other videos. And second of all, the Republicans actually passed Donald Trump's tax cuts in 2017 under budget reconciliation with no support at all from Democrats. And that was enormously unpopular. And they went ahead and did that, and also forced through 3 Supreme Court justices, Brett Kavanaugh, Neil Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett, all by nuking the filibuster. And these were major, major, major deals that had no Democratic buy-in at all. And now that the Democrats want to pass a law to protect voting, Mitch McConnell is saying, no, you can't do this. This is a terrible thing. And again, if you step back and look at this, it's like, now hang on a second. You are literally saying that it was more important to force through tax cuts for what is an extraordinarily small number of very wealthy Americans than it is to protect Americans' right to vote? That's not going to fly. That's simply not going to fly in a democracy. And so what you're seeing here is a couple of things. With McConnell going sort of ballistic over the filibuster, I think what you're seeing is the extraordinary importance of the bills that are known as HR1 or S1. Currently, I think they're identical. If not, they're very similar. And what they are is a protection of the right to vote. And this is a really big deal. So they get money out of politics. They address the loopholes that were opened up by the Citizens United decision, which permits a number of ways for major corporate interests to fund political speech that ended up backfiring in a huge way, as you know. You can see it in that's a 2013 Supreme Court decision, and the 2016 presidential election was flooded with money, including apparently foreign money. We're going to hear more about that, I think, in the next 4 years. So it gets rid of the loopholes in Citizens United. It makes sure that presidential candidates show their tax returns. It guarantees the right to vote. It makes mail-in vote. It basically modernizes our voting system, which, as somebody pointed out today, the rest of the world, democracies, have figured out how to make voting easy and safe. We don't have to reinvent any wheels. We know how to do this. But the problem for the Republicans is that since 1998, when Florida passed the first major voting restriction act since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Republican Party has increasingly depended on voter suppression, and after 2010 on gerrymandering. And that has increasingly, the reason that you don't want to do this, and I've talked about this elsewhere, the reason that this is a really bad idea for a party. I mean, it seems like a great idea. And here's an analogy. So an analogy I like. It seems like a great idea, right? You win. Except, think about it like a soccer game, if you will. If you have two teams that are equally, that the playing field's level, so I started to think about this playing field, right? The playing field is level. They both have to work really hard to win, and they have to know what they're doing, and they have to work hard, and they have to make goals. They have to accomplish stuff. But if the refs start to favor team A, then team B is going to work a little bit harder, and team A is going to get, they can have one or two people who aren't very good. And as that happens, team B over here is going to get stronger and stronger, and team A is going to get weaker and weaker. And the more that the refs work on the side of team A is going to get fat and happy, basically, and they're not going to do anything because they know they're going to win. They're just going to win because everything is stacked in their favor. And eventually, team B is going to get stronger and stronger, and eventually, team B can't win. It doesn't matter how good they are, they can't win. And when team B either gets really strong and team A knows they can't win, even by working the refs, what they can do is call in reinforcements and just overrun team B. Or team B can say, forget this, and they can throw out the whole game altogether and just go after team A without playing by the rules at all. So if you don't keep the playing field level, you lose the field altogether. Now, in that analogy, the Republican Party, because it had worked the refs, if you will, it had limited the vote, and it had gerrymandered and worked the Supreme Court and done all the things that you probably know about. Once you've done that, the problem with that is that you lose the ability to win fairly. You don't have ideas. You don't have good candidates. You don't have plans to go forward. And right now I'm picking on the Republicans, but you could say the exact same thing about the Democrats in the American South in the early 20th century. The game was rigged. The Democrats were always going to win in the South, so they didn't have to have great politicians. They didn't have to have great ideas. They didn't have to attract voters. They just were going to win. And so this is one of the reasons it's so important to keep the playing field level. And I always talk about there being a need for two parties, or at least two parties in a democracy. And this is why, because you're going to end up either having to get party A there simply taking over everything and saying to party B, we don't care how good you are, you don't stand a chance. We're going to get rid of you, either by making sure you can't vote or by violence, which happens in former democracies as well. So you either get one party rule, or you get a situation where you've got this party rule, and the team B is like, forget this, we're not playing by this game anymore, and they become violent. So you basically tear yourselves apart. And so where we are right now is with the Republicans determined not to let this voter protection law go into place. And if you read it, you don't read the summaries, because what it is, it's very long and it's kind of dull, to be honest. It's interesting to somebody like me, but I think it's like 365 pages. And the version I read actually had really type that was really hard to read, even for me, and I do a lot of that stuff. But but if you read what they're doing, and I think it was Steve Scalise said, oh, it's been written by the devil. No, it's not. It literally, mail-in voting, all the basic things that anybody should want, and that the Republicans did want until the last election, and they at this point recognized that there are only about 25% of the American voting population that is self-identified as a Republican any longer. It's a lot of independents, but there's only about a quarter of voters registered as Republican. And as you know, the Republican Party itself is tearing itself in half. So unless they can rig the vote, they're in huge trouble in the upcoming cycle. So this is why Mitch McConnell is going ballistic over the idea of this bill. And yet, here's the problem: is that if the bill doesn't pass, I mean, it really is a life or death bill for one party or the other, and not the parties are going to survive, but for democracy or not. Because if the Republicans manage to not to pass the HR 1 or Senate 1, that's how they're numbered, is HR 1. It's either HR 1 or S1, meaning House of Representatives 1 or Senate 1. It's how they're numbered when they come up with them. And the order in which they come is a reflection of when they are presented. And when you make it 1, you're saying this is a really big deal. But a lot of bills have much higher numbers, even though they're important, simply because of where they come up in the docket or where they come up when they're introduced. So, by the way, I love playing in the congressional records. So, so I'm probably boring you all, but for those of us who love it, it's actually just like a playground. Anyway, so what's at stake here, though, is that if this bill does not pass, if HR 1 or Senate 1 do not pass, what we are going to get is, as you probably know, there are 43 states in which Republican legislators have introduced, I think it's upwards of 150 voter restriction bills. And if those go into place, they are designing those restrictive laws to cut Democrats out of the vote. So, for example, in Texas, where there are all kinds of voter restriction bills being discussed in the legislature, a recent study out of the state looked at the 17 million votes that were cast in 2020 in Texas and discovered that 16, not 16 million, 16 of them, the person had given a bad address. It wasn't voter fraud, but they'd given a bad address. That's less than 1 in a million. So when we talk about that's fewer than 1 in a million. So when we talk about problems with voting being vanishingly small, this is what we mean. Now, on the other hand, remember that Texas went ahead and got rid of its drop boxes so that people couldn't drop off their ballots. They did all kinds of things to try and make sure that it was harder to vote. Which again is the story that I think will not be told in 2020. And so many people are horrified how close that election was. And my reaction is always like, well, yeah, it was not, if it were free and fair, I wonder what it would have looked like. And remember that it's very hard to beat an incumbent. So the fact that Biden came up with the highest the highest percentage win against an incumbent since FDR in 1932 is not insignificant. All right, so that's where we stand with why the filibuster is in the news and why it is so freaking important. Because if those Texas and the other 42 states, or the 43 states that are trying to restrict the vote, if they succeed, the same way that in Wisconsin right now, in the state of Wisconsin, even if Democrats win a majority of the popular vote by, I think it's 5 points, although I'm speaking off the top of my head, so I might be wrong about that. They still can't win a majority of the state legislature. Like, that's just wrong. Even if you get 55% of the vote, you're still a minority in the legislature. That's the way things are in Wisconsin. And that's the way that they're going to be nationally if HR 1 and Senate 1 don't pass. And that's why this is so freaking important, is that if they don't pass, we're going to be permanently governed by the Republican Party because they will have stacked the deck. And right now, of course, that looks like they're leaning toward Trump. Like we're going to be governed by, I'm not worried that Trump's going to run in 2024 at all, but somebody like him or somebody from his wing of the party. And you can see people like Ted Cruz from Texas and Josh Hawley from Missouri trying to be the next person in line to take over from Donald Trump. And those people are not messing around, let me tell you. So somebody asked, okay, so that's what's going on with the filibuster. So somebody asked here about voter ID laws and why the heck are they such a problem? Why, it seems like a no-brainer, right? Here we go with this. There's a long story behind voter ID. So the Democrats actually wanted to introduce voter ID. They wanted national ID cards, and I don't have the dates on that. I want to say in the 1970s, but I don't have those numbers in front of me. And the Republicans went nuts because they said this was federal overreach and that there was going to be a database of everybody and on and on and on. So that idea of having a national ID kind of fell by the wayside, although for all intents and purposes, most countries have a national ID. And I think it would be very easy to convince people to have a national ID, frankly. I mean, it would make our lives so much easier when you get on an airplane, right? Like certain states, you have to have certain kinds of licenses to get on an airplane and all kinds of stuff. Um, but we don't have that. We don't have a national ID. So what happens is, and the reason that ID laws are considered voter suppression is because of the way you write them. So, for example, if you say you have to have an ID to vote, well, that's a no-brainer, right? You should have to have an ID to vote. What's an ID? You know, does that mean you have to have a passport? Well, that means basically the only people who are going to vote are the people who travel overseas. Okay, well, so that's probably not good. What about a driver's license? Well, that kind of cuts out everybody who's over whatever age they stop driving, because you don't renew your license if you're not driving a car, or if you live in a city, or if you can't afford a car. Like I literally know people who are adults who don't know how to drive. What are they going to do? They're going to go to the DMV to get a driver's license. But how do you get to the DMVs? Because this is another way that you can suppress voting, is you can say you can only vote with a driver's license, and then take out the registries of motor vehicles in black neighborhoods, for example, which is precisely what I believe it was Georgia did, said you had to have a driver's license, and then they took the registries of motor vehicles out of black counties. So you would have to take the time to go somewhere else. So that's one way, but you can do it in other ways. The state of Texas, as I recall, and mind you, again, once again, I'm doing this off the top of my head. I don't have notes in front of me, so if I'm maligning your state, I apologize. But you can absolutely Google these things. In Texas, a hunting and fishing license counts as an ID, but a college identification does not. Well, as you know from the stereotype, college students tend to be stereotyped, at least, as voting Democratic, and hunters and fishermen stereotyped as voting for Republicans. So you can do this on down the list. One of the other ones that Texas did when Wendy Davis was running for office, she was very popular among women. So Texas passed a law that in order to vote, your legal name had to match your identification. Well, that's a no-brainer, right? Wrong, because whose names change? Not men's. Women's names change throughout their lives. When they get married or they get divorced. Okay, you say, well, that's not a big deal. When you get a divorce or you get married, you should make an effort to get your identification changed. It's expensive in Texas. It's like, I don't know, it's like 25 or 50 bucks, and it takes time. And let's be real. Like, how many times have you said, oh, I need to correct my license in the middle of your busy day, especially if you're a young woman who's at the age who would get married or get divorced. So the idea there was to cut women away from the vote. So that's why voter ID laws are the way they are currently written, tend to suppress the vote. Now, again, another great one that makes me nuts is that in certain states with a number of indigenous people in them, you have to have a street address in order to vote. Well, what if you live in a place that doesn't have a street address? And that may sound like, who does that in America? I got to tell you, we got a street address here in Maine, I don't know, 10 years ago or something, and only because the fire department needed it. You just knew where the roads were. And certainly if you're living on a reservation in South Dakota, for example, you don't have a street address. So there was an attempt, and I don't know how this came out, to actually make GPS count for your street address, because they didn't have street addresses to vote. And once you knock the indigenous people out of voting, they tend to vote Democratic. So these voter IDs are constructed in such a way that what they do is they throw Democrats out of the vote, at least the way that our political system currently is. All right. Somebody just talked about get an idea and had a terrible time after her husband died. All right. So in Massachusetts, you have to get a signed consent to, I didn't know that, to revert to your maiden name. All right. So now a couple quick questions before I run off to my dissertation defense. A couple of ones. People want to know what's going on with Kavanaugh, because that's in the news today. Brett Kavanaugh is a Supreme Court justice appointed by Donald Trump. And Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island went ahead today and asked the FBI to look into the background check that was done on Kavanaugh, because there were a number of women who had accused Kavanaugh of assaulting them, that who claim that the FBI refused to take their statements, and he is looking into that. Kavanaugh is a really interesting appointment, in a lot of ways because there was very little disclosure of his writings. Normally, there's a sort of 100% disclosure for a Supreme Court justice, just because you kind of want to know what you're getting into, and certainly the people who don't think they're going to like that Supreme Court justice want to know what they're getting into. But Kavanaugh, as you recall, went through very, very quickly, and I believe it was something like 96% of his writings were not disclosed, which is just weird. More important, there is some question about how what appeared to be gambling debts got erased shortly before he got nominated. So there's a lot about him that's different. That's a little bit. There's reasons that people are curious about how he ended up in that position. Now that somebody else wrote and said, can Supreme Court justices be impeached? Absolutely. Impeachment is reserved for a number of different positions in the government, and Supreme Court justices are absolutely one of them. But before we jump to that, let's see what this turns out. Maybe he's fine. You know, maybe maybe there was a legitimate way in which his debts were cleared. Maybe the accusations of assault will not pan out, and maybe in fact that the FBI is going to look perfectly clean. There's no doubt it looked funny in a number of different ways. The FBI director, Chris Wray, refused to talk about it to the Congress people at one point. So we'll see what happens with that. There is also the potential, of course, for a Supreme Court justice to step down. And that is, I think, probably more likely, if anything is there, than an impeachment would be my guess. But who knows? And I would like to point out, when I say that, I'm sure somebody's head just exploded. It's only recently that people remain Supreme Court justices until they're like 610. It used to be considered kind of a job, to be honest. There's at least one Supreme Court justice who stepped down from the Supreme Court to become a senator. It was not considered, I'm going to hang on here by the skin of my, by my fingernails until they carry me out toes up. So it would not be the unprecedented at all for a Supreme Court justice to decide to, to go back to private life and pull down serious bucks working, back in the law after having been a Supreme Court justice. So the other thing about Supreme Court justices that I always like to point out, and about senators and members of the House for that matter, but senators are where it really shows up nowadays, is that politics used to be a young man's game, and deliberately I use the word man there because this is in those days, because we have our oldest, until the last two elections, we had our oldest government in history because of modern advances in medicine that have kept people alive who wouldn't have been 50 years ago, and because of changes in transportation, because it's so easy now to get to Washington and get away from Washington. When you had to literally, as a Supreme Court justice, ride the circuit on the back of a horse, you weren't going to be doing it much beyond 55, maybe 60. You'd be like, forget this. And there's certainly no way that you would have, some of these elderly, 80 whatever year old justices clinging to the back of a horse, so they could ride courthouse to courthouse. So there have been physical changes to our world that are creating democratic problems in our democracy. So that's what people have asked about Kavanaugh. People have also asked, can President Biden fire DeJoy? No. And I'm fascinated by the whole DeJoy story. There is, well, actually, I don't think I wrote about it. I think I did one of these videos about it. That's one of the pieces that I really am eager to write, is the history of the United States Postal Service, which is fascinating. But DeJoy is actually appointed by the Post Office Board, the USPS board, and the board is filled with rotating seats, and it is therefore supposed to be nonpartisan. The United States Postal Service is supposed to be run in a nonpartisan fashion, but when Trump came into office, a senator put a hold on all of Obama's nominees. So the Trump had a very free hand to go ahead and fill that board, and it was actually Trump nominees on the board who chose DeJoy. And DeJoy is problematic for a number of reasons, and one of them is that he owns a lot of stock in a company that competes with the United States Postal Service. And one of the things to remember about the USPS is that it has valuable plants, of course, and valuable trucks and all that, but what it really has is proprietary information that is extraordinarily valuable, that that private industry would like very much to get its hands on. And in fact, before the United States Postal Service could access the relief that was provided to it in one of the earlier coronavirus bills, the USPS board agreed to turn over a bunch of proprietary information to Steve Mnuchin from Treasury, which made me very angry. Because I like the USPS a lot for a number of reasons. Among other things, it hires an enormous number of our veterans and people of color. So DeJoy was technically appointed by them. So not technically, he was appointed by them, but they were appointed by Trump. Biden has put forward three within the last 2 days. I think it was Monday. I don't know. Recently, put forward 3 names to put on that board, and that would give him a majority of people who could get rid of DeJoy. And one of the things that's worth remembering about the Trump administration, and many people did not pay attention to this because it happened early on when there was all the stuff about the bans and all that, the Muslim ban and all the travel bans it was called and all that, is that Trump did put forward a policy paper that had a number of things in it. And one of them was he very deliberately called for the privatization of the post office. That was absolutely on the table, and I don't see that anybody ever talked about it. And it's there in black and white. This is what we need to do. We need to privatize the USPS, and here's why. And so it made utter sense to have DeJoy in there because DeJoy thinks he can make a lot of money doing it. Okay, so Stephanie asked, have there been any attempts to expand the House of Representatives since it was capped in 29? Is it a possibility? There have been, yes, and there's a major move now afoot to do so. It doesn't, to much that I have seen, have a very clear policy written out yet, but their argument is actually not about what I would argue about, which is the Electoral College. They make the very good point that because of the cap, and the cap that keeps out so much smaller than it ought to have been if, as originally planned, there was a representative for, I believe it was every 30,000 inhabitants. Right now, on average, each representative represents, it's about like 740,000 people. Don't quote me on that, but it's in the many, many hundreds of thousands. And of course, some people have fewer constituents and some have more. But what this means is that representatives can no longer adequately represent their constituents, because while I'm talking about lawmaking, Congress critters actually do a lot more than that. They help people out who are in bad, they're supposed to be kind of your interface with the government. And if they've got 30,000 people to take care of, they can do that. If they have 1 million, it ain't happening. So there is an argument afoot to say that Congress could simply work better and people would get better service. And by service, I don't mean like, I don't, like checks or anything, but I mean like, here's a great example. When there's a scam going around, for example, like, I don't know if any of you have been hit by one of these, but many years ago, I got back in the days when you got phone calls, collect phone calls. Somebody called and asked if I would accept a collect phone call, and I hate the phone like poison, so I said no and hung up, figuring whoever it was would write to me or to get in touch with me in some other way by email. And I got on my phone bill, I got a charge for something minor, $4 or something minor. And I had time and I thought, oh, well, I'll contest this because I know I didn't say yes. I very much know I didn't say yes. And I went around and around and around and around and around with those people. And they kept saying, we can't help you. This is when you had separate long distance callers. We can't help you unless you're one of our customers. But if you become one of our customers, then we can fix it. And I'm like, that's a scam. You can't do that. Well, what did I do finally? I finally got in touch both with the consumer protection people in my state, but also with a congressperson, and said something's going on here. Like, I don't care about my $4, but if they're doing this to 100,000 of us, that's a scam. And within about a year, I wasn't the only one who complained, but those people got fined. It got, yes, they got taken to court, they lost, and they got fined. And I guess lots of people got back a $4 check. I didn't, because I didn't care about the $4. I cared about the idea that they were skimming off people's phone bills. Well, if you had 30,000 people to look after in situations like that, you could do it. If you have 1 million, that's what I'm talking about by service. So that's why people are talking about increasing the size of the House of Representatives. And finally, people have asked again and again about, Karen is pointing out rating the U.S. Pension Fund, and that's one of the big things is people want the whole idea of rating pension funds is that private industry wants to get its hands on that pension money. All right, so now the final thing before I run off, people are asking, and sometimes quite negatively, about what's happening on the border. And somebody actually put on my list of questions, why isn't Biden doing anything about the border? Well, so I want to call your attention to two things. Oh, this isn't what I want to talk about, but I will. I want to call your attention to two things. First of all, Biden is very deliberately pushing attention away from himself onto his cabinet secretaries. And so Anthony Blinken gave, the Secretary of State gave a really important speech shortly after he took office. And I swear nobody covered it. And it was really important, and it's in print and you can read it. And he talks about democracy and how we're on this cusp between democracy and autocracy. And democracy has got to win, and we care about this, and these are our principles. And what was really cool about it was he is talking to America, but he was also talking to people around the world. It really didn't get the coverage it ought to have. The new Homeland Security guy, Mayorkas, has also given a very important speech that I don't think got covered by anybody. And these are both on C-SPAN, by the way. And my trick is I speed them way up. And so I can, if they're talking for 40 minutes, I can cover it much quicker than that. You may not want to listen to these, but if you do, keep that in your back pocket, because I just want the information, and sometimes I just read the transcripts. But Mayorkas has been doing stuff and coming out and saying stuff, and he basically got no coverage. So today, this morning, he issued a really important statement, and I was very happy about it, because when I wrote the thing I did the other day about immigration, I did that because I could not tell what the heck was going on. Like there was a border crisis, but nobody was talking about it. And I started looking it up, and it all seemed to be from the right wing. And I'm like, well, there must be something going on, but who's doing it? And it took hours and hours and hours just for me to piece together that, which wasn't great in my mind. So today he released a statement that lays out what is happening. Declarative sentence after declarative sentence. Now, that being said, of course, he is going to put the best spin on things he can. So read it that way. But that being said, these people in this administration really seem committed to being transparent. And but it is worth reading between the lines what they're doing. So Biden is very deliberately not taking the limelight. He's doing that deliberately, because what that will do is that will force journalists to stop just going, Mr. President, what do you think about? And instead go listen to Anthony Blinken, who's actually very good at what he does, or to listen to Mayorkas here, or later on to any of the other people who are speaking. They give these big speeches and nobody goes to hear them. It's like the tree falling in the forest. But anyway, he gave Mayorkas gave this statement below, and it's widely available today, and it's great, because it's a lot about what I covered the other day about how there are a lot of people coming to the border. There have been for a while. The Trump administration simply refused to let them in. And right now, the Biden administration is like Ted Cruz is saying, it's an open border, which is just complete, as someone said, bull mess. They're not accepting any single travelers. Done. They're just rejected. On the protocols from the Trump administration about COVID. So you're also reading people saying, oh, he's no different than Trump. He's just throwing people out. He's using a Trump era administration rule. It's a rule by the CDC. So yes, it was the CDC who did it under Trump, but this is about the pandemic. It's not a policy. But so no single people and no families unless there is a family member who is extraordinarily at risk. Okay, so here he says, I actually called this up so I could tell it to you, and I'm not going to tell you the thing I wanted to tell you about. Says we are expelling most single adults and families. We are not expelling unaccompanied children. And we are executing the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, public health authority to safeguard the American public and the migrants themselves and protecting the children. This is not new. We've always had surges, it says. And then it goes on. This is the part that this was new to me. Families apprehended are being expelled under the CDC authority. Families from Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries are expelled to Mexico unless Mexico does not have the capacity to absorb them. That's going to be the big loophole there. Families from countries other than Mexico or the Northern Triangle, because remember, there's plenty of other people from other countries, including European, African, and Asian countries trying to come across that border. They are expelled by plane to their countries of origin, except when a family member has an acute vulnerability. Let me see what else I wanted to tell you. Our border resources are strained, but here's what he says. We are encountering many unaccompanied children at our southwest border every day. A child who is under the age of 18 and not accompanied by their parent or legal guardian is considered under the law to be an unaccompanied child. We are encountering 6 and 7-year-old children, for example, arriving at our border without an adult. They are vulnerable, and we have ended the previous administration's practice of expelling them. An unaccompanied child brought to a Border Patrol facility and processed for transfer to the Department of Health and Human Services, is brought and prepared. Customs and Border Protection is a pass-through, and it is required to transfer the child to HHS within 72 hours of apprehension, picking the kid up. HHS holds the child for testing and quarantine and then shelters the child until that child is placed with a sponsor in the US. In 80% or more cases, that child will be with a family member. In 40% of cases, it's with a parent, and they're being reunited with those children. And then they go into the immigration system where they can make a claim to be admitted under the law or not. I mean, the law doesn't have to admit them, they can make a claim. The Border Patrol facilities have been crowded with children, and the Biden administration says up front here, the 72-hour time frame is not always met. They're not making it in 72 hours. I've seen numbers as high as 75 hours because they don't have the capacity. And they don't have the capacity in part because there are a lot of people coming because of the storms in the Triangle countries, because of poverty and so on. But also, and because of the pandemic, but also because, and Mayorkas said this from the minute he got into office, the prior administration completely dismantled the system. They got rid of the asylum people. And this is one of the reasons that it matters who's in charge. If you don't want to give people asylum, even though that is required, you don't have to give them asylum, but you have to let them apply for asylum by law. If you don't do that, you should get rid of all the people who are qualified to do it. You just empty the offices, similarly to the way that the Trump administration emptied out the State Department. If there's no one there to do the work, it doesn't get done. The system was gutted, facilities were closed, and they cruelly expelled young children into the hands of traffickers. So this is one of the big issues, is that after they were no longer allowed to separate the children and move them into foster care in America, which is an untold story that's going to be ugly, instead they often were simply expelling these children back across the border into the hands of traffickers and gangs. And that's just absolutely horrific. So we had to rebuild the entire system, including the policies and procedures required to administer the asylum laws that Congress passed long ago. And what they say is that and then there were no plans to protect the frontline workers against COVID-19. There was no planning for the pandemic. And they, as you know, they also cut foreign aid to the Triangle countries, so that those situations there simply got worse. So if you are interested in this, they're vaccinating the frontline workers. They're trying to open the facilities. They're trying to get more people down there to help. they really do seem to be trying to solve this immediate problem without yet taking on the larger policy issue. And one of the things that frustrates me is when people mix these two things up together. So you can't really try and fix this issue and the policy thing at the same time. It seems to me that this is an emergency that needs to be fixed. Got to vaccinate people, got to rebuild the facilities, got to get more people down there to help, got to speed up the system. Fixing that is like staunching the bleeding, and then we have to talk about the larger policy issues. But if anybody's interested, I thought this was a wonderful statement, and I was so glad that they said it, because if I couldn't figure it out after sitting at my table for 6 hours going, what's really happening? Then I had a pretty good sense that a lot of other people couldn't figure it out either. I think one of the reasons that they haven't really wanted to tackle it quite so publicly is that in this case, there's pressure on both sides, where the Republicans are saying, the borders are open, and people on the left are saying, the borders are locked shut, and you're no different than Trump. And it's probably no accident, now that I think about it, that Mayorkas launched this, gave us a statement the day after the confirmation of Deb Haaland there at the Interior Department. All right, so I'm going to run off to my my students' dissertation defense. I hope this was somewhat useful, and I will. What I wanted to talk about, and you know what, I'm going to tell you what I wanted to talk about tonight quickly, or what I wanted to talk about. Look at the fact that Congress is trying to get rid of the authorization for military force that got us into Afghanistan. That's a really big deal. It's an attempt to cut back on this executive power that has grown so astronomical, really, since World War II, but really since the George W. Bush administration, and to put the power back in Congress. And I find that fascinating. All right, I'm off to my dissertation defense, and I wish you the best, and I hope I will see you tonight. I gotta warn you, I'm really tired, so I might post a picture tonight. But if I don't, there's so much going on tonight, it will be an exciting letter to write. And I will see you on Thursday doing history, or next week doing politics. Thank you for being here.
You asked about the 2026 election and what's going to happen with the 2026 election. And you also asked in that context about Steve Bannon's statement today that Donald Trump would run again in 2028, and they had a plan for that. Now, let's step back just a little bit on that and start from the premise again. And one of the things I was thinking about talking today, and I was thinking one of the things that's always worth thinking about is, if you were going to do something, how would you do it? Because that shows you how much of stuff that you're afraid of maybe doesn't come to pass. So, like literally, one of the things that I would used to say to my students, if you got to start a movement, how are you going to do it? Like literally, how are you going to do it? Well, you're going to find a friend or two, and you're going to start talking. But, pretty soon, for example, you need to be able to identify other people who think like you do. So what are you going to do? Maybe clothes, maybe a flag. But if it's going to be a flag, it's going to be a really simple flag, because you got to be able to just do it really quickly. If it's a popular flag, you just work through how you would literally do something. So in the case of Trump running again, literally, how would you do that? There is a constitutional amendment saying he can't. However, we already have a blueprint that he tried in 2020, which was that they would simply refuse to recognize the legitimate election of a Democrat. And that, I think, we can absolutely see coming, not least because of the fact that the administration is putting election deniers into important places. They're trying to get rid of voting rights in a number of states. They're trying to gerrymander the states in such a way that the Republicans get a huge leg up. The Supreme Court is certainly considering throwing out the Voting Rights Act, which will give the Republicans another 19 seats, up to 19 seats in the House of Representatives. You can see the steel already going into place. That's a real problem that I'll talk about more and write about more in the future, because I want to get something in before that today. But now let's think about really what that looks like in 2020. In 2028, about Trump running again. What does that really look like? Do you really think they're going to be able to prop him up and be even vaguely coherent in 3 more years? I don't. I don't know if you watched his press conference today, but it was bonkers. I mean, the man is not okay. And so if you're worried about 2028, once again, I think that, and Trump, that's probably borrowing trouble in the case of Trump. But the problem in the terms of the skewing of our system so that whichever Democrat, I'm sorry, I keep doing that because I want to talk about the Democrats, whichever Republican wins is runs is automatically going to win. That's really concerning. And that's what a number of people, including me, are very, very worried about. Now, again, we're hearing a lot about the 2026 election. That was 2028. Now, the 2026 election, and somebody wrote to me, didn't put it on there, but wrote to me and asked a great question about what the Democrats should do in terms of their ideology going into 2026, this one coming up. And this is very dear to my heart because I'm seeing a lot of discussion within the Democratic Party and to the left of it about whether the Democrats should go centrist or whether they should go progressive. And I have a really hard time with this argument, not least because I'm not paying a lot of attention to the structure of the Democratic Party right now. But because what does that look like? What does that mean in today's America to go centrist? And I think what people, I think, and I could be wrong, but I think what people mean is to be more like the Republicans. To try and pick up Republican voters by kind of wiggling over toward the Republicans. And what I would say to that is that the Republican Party currently has veered so far to the right, it's off the cliff. And to be a centrist American right now is to embrace the policies that are being talked about as if they're progressive, as if they are somehow on the left, and they're really not. The idea of taxing people more progressively than they currently are, so that the wealthier people pay more in taxes. So our world looks much more like it did under George W. Bush, for example, hardly a left-wing reactionary, or under in the 1990s when we'd last had a budget surplus under Clinton, looking like that is extraordinarily popular. So personally, I would call that centrist. Higher taxes on the wealthy is a really popular position. What about things like healthcare? Do we go what does centrist mean in a world in which the Republicans are trying to cut Medicaid dramatically and throw millions of people off their health care? To me, centrist says people should have health care. And by the way, the person who first suggested that in the United States is Theodore expletive Roosevelt more than 120 years ago. He was a Republican president at the beginning of the 20th century. That to me does not say progressive in a derogatory sense. That says centrist. So when people say, what should the Democrats do? What I look at in this moment is the 1850s, because in that moment we had something that looks very similar, I think, to where we are today. That is, the Democrats in that period, the parties have switched sides. The Democrats in that period had fallen under the control of a very small group of elite enslavers who were really, really, really wealthy and really controlled the American economy. And they basically said, hey, it's our country. We get to run it however we want. We're going to spread human enslavement into the American West. We're going to take over the North through the House of Representatives. And we're going to start, and you can read this, by the way, it's in things like the Cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens. We're going to run the world because we have all the money and we're going to enslave people all over the world. That's not the way they put it, but that's, this is the great future they kept talking about. And when that happened, people in the North who recognized that they were going to lose access to the American West and lose democracy in the American North said, No, you're not going to do that. Even though we have been voting Democratic or voting Whig, which were the opponents of the Democrats, we're pissed off that the Whigs are not taking a stronger stand, and we're sure not going to cooperate with the Democrats. And they came together as what were known as the anti-Nebraska parties. I'm not going to go into the Kansas-Nebraska Act right now, but they went into these anti-Nebraska parties, and for 2 years, they didn't really have any idea yet except what they weren't. It's going to be Abraham Lincoln who decides to articulate what they are for. But when that happened, the people who stood up and said, "We believe in equality before the law. We believe in the idea of equal access to resources. We believe in the idea that we have a say in our government, and we are opposed to oligarchy." Those people won. They won across the board, even in the states that were dominated by the Democrats, who were thoroughly racist at the time. This idea that somehow the Democrats, the Northerners, were all in favor of black rights in 1860s, just in the 1850s, is just completely wrong. And similarly in Massachusetts, for example, the laws that they were passing there were fervently anti-Irish. So the idea that people were in favor of equal rights is just wrong. What they were in favor of was the idea that they were not going to lose their democracy to an oligarchy. But crucially, there was huge push from the American people for people to stand up and to fight for those principles. Now, what does that look like in 2025? To me, it looks like fighting back against the things that we're seeing out of the White House right now. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, and to fight for the things that we care about: education, healthcare, equal access to resources, equal treatment before the law, no more special interests running our government. All those things that have really, really wide support among the country. So this division between, first of all, this I don't know what centrist means in a world where all the positions that are identified in many media sources are actually, as progressive, are actually shared by more than 70% of Americans. That sounds pretty centrist to me. But I think what they mean is cozying up to the positions that Republicans have taken in the hopes that somehow that will peel away Republican voters. And I'm just not sure that's the case. I think that Republican voters are upset by corruption and by the takeover of our system by the wealthy and by the lack of health care and by the lack of education and so on, as Democratic voters are. They just need to have people stand up and articulate that. Now, again, you asked the question, that's where I am on that issue. And let me just go a little further than you asked about. And that's that, what does that mean? Does it mean we shut up the candidates who are farther to the left and we move to the candidates that are farther to the right? I maintain that we need all of the voices, especially right now, but we need all of those voices participating in our government right now, because they're waking people up to issues they didn't even know they cared about. And they're making people understand that those issues could be addressed at the state or the national level or the local level. And so I'm not a big believer in silencing new voices, especially voices you don't like. I think those are very, very welcome. It's important, though, to remember that in order to get things through a state house or through Congress, you need to know what you're doing. You need to be able to make compromises. You need to understand the different areas of the country. You need to understand what it is possible to get through. And you have to be willing to work to build the structures that will enable you to do that. So, as you know, if you listen to me, I care very deeply about American taxation and how it has been really perverted, I think, over the last 40 years. And, if I could wave a magic wand, that's what I would do first. I would fix American taxation. Well, you know what? I can't wave a magic wand. In order to get something like that through the Congress, you've got to change who's in the Congress. And in order to change who's in the Congress, you have to change who's in the state houses. Because in order to get it through Congress, you've got to get rid of partisan gerrymandering. And you've got to get rid of a Supreme Court that is going to support that kind of partisan gerrymandering. And that kind of slow building work over a generation is not something that is in my wheelhouse, and it's not something I think the Democrats have been very good at. So, one of the things that it's important to remember in the next couple of years is, yes, we want all those voices, but we need those voices to recognize what it takes to build a governmental movement, because throwing bombs just doesn't do anything. You need to be able to get in there and work with people.